know there ain't no stopping us. Fly without boarding pass. Couldn't catch me, I'll be moving fast. Call me a shooting star. Let 'em know who you are. Flying up in a bar. Wish on a star. Time to show 'em who's in charge. Call me a shooting star. Didn't even get to cross. I said I'm moving too far. Get to glass. Looking at a shooting star. Got more than a couple of people going mad. I swear they're rooting hard. Tell them I'd be big in the game like she went and got them breast implants. I said I'm moving too fast. Didn't even get to glance. I'm ready to eat up track like I'm seated in a restaurant. If you had swag like mine, you know it's best to flaunt. We aren't hating because you aren't. Shining like it's neon. Rock like kings of Leon. Shooting stars across the galaxy. I stand out, so don't be mad at me. Infiltrate, I'm with my strategy. When I turn up, then I just have to leave. Shooting stars across the galaxy. I stand out, so don't be mad at me. Infiltrate, I'm with my strategy. When I turn up, then I just have to leave. Yeah, shoot. Yeah, shoot. Yeah, shooting. Yeah, shooting shots. Shooting stars. Didn't even get to cross. I said I'm moving too far. Get to glass.
Well, hello everyone. I've got something weird going on with Ecamm, so as I switch scenes, I'm going to have to just set them all up. My settings wouldn't hold. Don't know why. So what we are going to be going over tonight is I had some audio recordings that I didn't really want to wait until they fit into the chronology of what we're doing, and particularly since we're now in the 50-year anniversary of the party, which is just amazing. I wanted to do some of the other anniversary celebrations. So I had an interview tape from when David Nolan was interviewed on the 30th anniversary. And what was amazing about this interview, besides, party history is just amazing, but it was 4 days before 9/11. You know, you're listening to some of the things he says, like he's complaining that he had to show ID to get a hotel room. In 4 short days, things would change rapidly, and his view, I'm sure, would be much different. So that I thought was a pretty interesting snapshot. I also had found various other videos of David on YouTube that I pulled some clips out of. So not all of the clips will be the 30th anniversary interview. You'll know when it's the interview because there'll be a back and forth. And that interview was turned into an article that was condensed down. But what we're listening to is the raw tapes, because I spoke with the reporter who sent me the actual interview tapes, which I just thought was super cool. And I wanted to share with you guys. This has been up on LPD, probably 2-3 years now. But I'm not so sure how many people have taken advantage of listening to it. I also put up the full interview files up on the YouTube channel for the Libertarian Party Historical Preservation Committee. I have the clips separated kind of by subject matter, and they do jump around a little bit. But let's just listen to them and perhaps have some commentary. So let me set that up. I'm going to have to mess around with the scenes here a little bit. Okay, got that up. So now let me put me back up here. Let's put this up here. Here we go. And I want to get the chat widget up just in case anybody happens to be in chat. I'll be able to see it right up on the screen along with everyone else. Okay, so let me now go find these sound files. 1 second here. Okay, the first one is, I believe it was from the 1980 convention. I could be wrong. David had given this speech multiple times, but he is talking about his priorities for the party, which interestingly, I disagree with. And it's not a point of view that you will hear often today, but it was his point of view. So I will play that file. Just 1 sec here. I wanted to see if I had notes on it. Yes, he entitled this, I believe, Principles Before Votes. Now, I absolutely agree with him that principles have to come before votes. But where he takes this is a little bit different than I would. So let's listen. And if you have any input, please stick it in chat.
And I would hope that we would back away a little bit from the mindset that has been growing in recent years, where the idea of running lots of candidates becomes the goal, getting lots of votes becomes the goal, and then we go, well, to run lots of candidates and to have status, we have to have 50 state ballot status. 50 state ballot status is a tactical goal. It is a step along one of many paths towards liberty, and a path that probably isn't even the most cost-effective one. So while I'm certainly not urging that we not try to have ballot status, I hope we will maintain our perspective and realize that in the grand scheme of things, in the ongoing battle for liberty, that attaining 50 state ballot status is not really a terribly high priority. I think the other things that I've outlined, building our membership, reaching out via strong issue stands on the issues of the day, and effectively using the mass communications media are all far more important than running lots of candidates and getting ballot status everywhere. Those are my opening remarks. I thank you all very much.
Now, I found that really interesting. And that's where I disagree. And hey there, Julian. For one thing, he didn't believe 50 state ballot access was a high priority. I absolutely disagree with him on that. And in listening to some of his other talks, I would surmise that his reason for that is we're not going to be winning the presidency anytime soon. But to me, that's besides the point. And I think he is contradicting almost himself. If you remember back when we talked about his article, A Case for a Libertarian Political Party, he talked about how being on the ballot and being a candidate was basically free advertising. And wouldn't you want to have as much as possible to be on the ballot in 50 states rather than just a few? Plus, people don't take your lower ticket candidates seriously when you don't have a top of ticket. That is just a fact. And for instance, in Colorado, where we have very easy ballot access, when we're at outreach booths, still got questioned quite a bit from people asking if we were on the ballot in all 50 states. And if you say no, or, you know, if you're shy a few, okay. But like if you're only on the ballot in 10 states, 15 states, 20 states, anything less than half, I don't think unless you got above 30 that you're even nearing respectability, the people write you off. They don't think you're a serious party. They don't really understand how difficult it is. But there is something to be said for how just simply having the name on the top of the ticket helps the down ticket candidate. So I absolutely disagree with him, though this is an ongoing debate always with each new LNC. I always vote for ballot access expenditures. Some people think it's a waste of our money because we have to keep doing it year after year after year. I just don't share that opinion. And for the same reason, I also believe in full slates where possible. In Colorado, because we have such easy ballot access, there isn't even for most races, and I think for all partisan races, there are no filing fees. There might be for some nonpartisan races. Why wouldn't we even just put a line holder? I was a line holder last time, and I got, 6% of the vote or something around there, 5%. So we definitely need to fill the ballot. And I don't think that at all compromises our principles. And there's a way to make line holders into perfect candidates. There's a guy here in Colorado, Joe Johnson, who has absolutely perfected that. And perhaps we'll talk about that in another episode on how to effectively run line holders. But on that, I would disagree with him. Also, this being 1980, and again, that was a very summary statement. I'm sure he would agree that in order for us to get our down ticket candidates on the ballot in the states that require you to have certain percentages on the top of the ticket race, that it would be very important to be on that ballot. So that was just interesting on a foundational disagreement I would have with David Nolan. Though I will say, when I was Region 1, my predecessor was Norm Olson in Colorado, and he would have agreed with David. He routinely voted against ballot access expenditures, instead choosing to spend the money elsewhere. Okay, so the next clip we have, I believe all the rest of these, let me take a look here. I believe all the rest of these are from the interview. I'll let you know if, oh no, this one is not. Okay, that's definitely the interview. I'm going to play all of them that aren't from the interview. Okay, this next clip, David is talking about whether we should only stress the most popular policy positions. So let's take a listen to that. If I've queued up the right one.
The one issue area, or the one tactical area where I have some disagreement that I'd like to address, is the point that Larry Dodge raised about emphasizing our most popular planks. I'm not against emphasizing popular planks or popular stands as a general tactic. However, quite often we will find that we're going to be faced with the choice between taking the stands that are, quote, most popular and taking stands on the issues which are the greatest threats to individual liberty. Right now, and I must say that Dave Walter's analogy to drawing the parallel between the war on drugs now and the war in Vietnam 15, 20 years ago is a very apt one. Right now we're at the stage where the, quote, war on drugs, which is really a war on the American people, a war on civil liberties. That, quote, war is popular at the moment, and our stand against it is going to be unpopular, but that doesn't mean we should back away from it, because if we back away from it, there's virtually no opposition left. Sometimes you have to take the stand that's unpopular because the thundering herd has been fanned into hysteria on an issue, and unless somebody says, wait a minute, this is wrong, this is dangerous, we shouldn't be doing this, and is willing to stand up and make that stand. So I think we have to bear in mind that sometimes it's important to take the stand that's unpopular because that's where the greatest threat is coming from. Thank you.
Absolutely agree with him there. There was a circumstance back during the time when the bakers in Colorado were getting persecuted by the state. Actually, baker, singular. Masterpiece Bakery, for refusing to bake a cake for a gay wedding. That was a huge, huge issue, a huge religious freedom issue, a huge private business issue. And the National Party said a little bit on it, but not very much. And when our former chair, Sarwark, was confronted with this by some members of the Radical Caucus, he had said, well, you can't lead with your chin, because he realized that that would not be a very popular position. And I love what Mark Montoni said to Chair Sarwark. He said, sometimes that's the only way you can lead. And that right there nails it. We can't shy away from the positions that are an immediate threat to liberty or are immediately in the news. Well, I don't think whether or not, florists or photographers or bakeries were necessarily, them being forced to provide these services was the greatest threat to our liberties on that day. It was the threat to our liberties that was in the headlines. And that's what we need to address. I would agree with David Nolan, though, that it remains, the war on drugs is still probably the greatest threat to our liberty. I don't think we realize how much that impacts everything else and how it put its vile tentacles into nearly every policy, and how much freedom would be gained almost immediately if the war on drugs were abolished. Okay, so the rest of this will be from the Avi Armstrong interview 4 days before 9/11, which was on the 30th anniversary of the party. The first clip, and these are slightly out of order, I believe. Doesn't matter because I grouped them by subject matter. The first clip is talking about David's recollections of the founding members of the party.
Right. In addition to Mr. Zell, who else was around back then?
Okay, the initial, it's getting so long without looking at my notes, I'll have to scratch my head a little bit. That may sound stupid because it wasn't a very large group. Incidentally, would you be so kind as to send me an electronic transcript of the article to review? Not that I'm going to try to censor you or anything, but just to make sure that if I've gotten anything wrong or to give me a chance to correct any minor errors that might creep in.
Yeah, of course. And I will edit it in terms of just
right, I'm just kind of talking off the cuff to give you the information. You're going to have to sift through it and organize it and present it in the most logical fashion.
Yeah,
I understand, having been a newsletter editor and newspaper editor and so forth for much of my life, so I know how that goes. Back to the immediate question. The original group of 5 was myself, my then wife, Susan, who I have lost track of. She got remarried after we broke up and still lives in the Denver area, but she dropped completely out of any activity in the Libertarian Party. A gentleman named Hugh Futch, F-U-T-C-H, who lives up in Bailey, or at least did until a few years ago, out in the mountains. I guess it's not as far out in the mountains as it was 30 years ago. Civilization has crept out, and he's surrounded by civilization now, which probably doesn't please him. He's kind of a wild-eyed mountain man type. A college student named Dale Nelson, who disappeared shortly thereafter and has never been heard from again. And a fellow named John James, who was a young, at that time, architect who lived in Denver. and was our first candidate for U.S. Congress in, I believe, either 1972 or 1974, there in the Denver area. Those were the original five. We were soon joined, so to speak, or had connected. John James had a half-brother named Pip, P-I-P-P, Boyles, B-O-Y-L-S or B-O-Y-L-E-S, in Colorado Springs. And he contacted Pip, who was a like-minded person. They were both very much into Ayn Rand and the whole objectivist movement at the time. And Pip had two more friends down there, Eric Westling, W-E-S-T-L-I-N-G, and Luke Zell. And we had grown to 8 by the time we took the vote, so to speak, and formally decided that we were going to go ahead with the party. The criteria we had set was that we were going to contact libertarians and free market-minded people around the country throughout the period. On August 15th, we decided we were going to see if there was anybody else that felt the way we did. So we sent out letters. I had a couple of mailing lists. One was a list of people that had bought bumper stickers and buttons from me over the last several years. I'd been running ads in the back of libertarian publications, or what there were in those days, little newsletters and so forth. I also had the mailing list. I had several small mailing lists, and a couple of the other people did too, I think. So we sent out some mailings to people around the country that we thought might be reasonable prospects, people who might feel the same way that we did that the time had come to form a new party. And our criterion was, if we got 100 positive responses, 100 people saying, count me in, by the end of the year, that we would go ahead and do it. And we had meetings every month to review results and talk over new ideas and new plans and feedback that we'd gotten from people around the country, which was all pretty positive. So we met again in September and October and November. And by December, we had over 100 respondents. So we said, we're going to do it. And we voted that evening, December 11th, to form the party and held a press conference early in January of 1972 to announce this fact to the world, and got a surprisingly large amount of press coverage, probably more than it deserved, and it probably gave us more encouragement than it should have. And we thought, wow, the world's ready for this. I'm not sure the world was ready for that 30 years ago. It may not still be quite ready, but we got a surprising amount of press coverage out of that first press conference in January.
Cool.
All righty. Now, I left some of the, and that microphone sounds that are in there, that's not me. That's on the original recording. This was a telephone recording, not the best quality, but it is a voice from the past, and unfortunately a voice from the grave, with David Nolan passing away in 2010. Really wish I could have met him. So the original 5, I want to know what happened to that college student that helped found the party and then disappeared. I have looked for him, but the name is very common. I think it was Dale Nelson, and that's not much help. Though I'm sure if I had some of the more sophisticated skip trace software that I used to have when I was tracking down witnesses, I would be able to find him, potentially by knowing that at one point he was in Colorado Springs, Colorado. But without that kind of private investigative software, impossible. That's just way too common of a name, but maybe somebody out there knows something. Would love to get in touch with Dale Nelson. Okay, and I also left in, I wanted to tell you some of that extraneous where he was asking to edit and stuff, because David's, I hesitate to call it casual, because this is him being somewhat casual, and it's still formal. I just found his manner of speaking and his precision interesting, and something that is very common amongst libertarians that non-libertarians find a little off-putting. You know, it's a characteristic that I have noticed from many. Okay, the next clip is about someone named Gail Norton, who you'll hear. It's somebody who was a Colorado libertarian and then ended up defecting to the Republican Party and had a high position. So not in the party, ended up having an appointed, I believe it was a cabinet position in the Republican Party and the administration at that time. But let's take a listen to what David has to say about Gail Norton. And I believe that's clip number 3.
Did you know Gail Norton, or was she after your time?
Gail Norton joined the party. I think she was actually an official member. In fact, I know she was because she was a delegate to the 1979 convention. To quickly answer your second question, no, she wasn't before my time. I didn't leave Colorado until 15 years ago, 1986, and Gail was active in like 1978, 1979. And Gail happened to become involved because she was close friends with a woman named Mary Louise Hanson, often generally just called ML for her initials. And ML Hanson was maybe even a vice president, but she had some kind of role down at the First National Bank of Denver, and she was the national vice chair of the party. And she was very gung-ho libertarian in those days, the late 70s, and so she recruited a lot of her women, businesswomen friends to at least come to some of our events and hear our speakers and learn about the party. And Gail was one of those. And Gail was kind of a quiet, reserved, studious kind of person, not real outgoing, pleasant enough from my recollection, but not a real outgoing, person. Kind of quiet and reserved. And she came to a number of the meetings, and I remember having at least a couple of conversations with her, and she seemed pretty sincere in her devotion to libertarian ideas, at least in the broad sense. Now, I understand that after I left Colorado, she got, picked up by the Republicans. They sensed that she was a promising young woman, because she's bright and so forth. And I guess they ran her for, Attorney General, and she served a term or two as that. And at that time, I've been told, she worked to try to keep us off the ballot and worked to try to hinder the Libertarian Party in its growth.
I was not aware of that.
That you would be better off to verify that with somebody who's been around for a long time. One such person, obviously, would be Dave Akin.
Right.
Another would be Paul Grant. Do you know Paul, or do you know who he is?
I know both of them. So.
Okay, yeah. They can fill you in more on what Gail Norton did after leaving the Libertarian Party and joining the Republican Party in, I guess, the late 80s or early 90s. And, of course, we all know she's Secretary of the Interior now, and I hope she can do some good there. I don't know how much good you can do in a appointed position like that with all the bureaucracy, but I'm sure her sentiments or her instincts are to push for, changes in the right direction, at least to some degree. I don't think she would push for the kinds of radical change or fundamental change that many of us would like to see in terms of privatizing federally held lands and so forth. But I think she will try to work at least for, the right kinds of things on some scale as Secretary of the Interior.
Okay. I've heard that in New York in the late 60s and early 70s, there were actually meetings about the formation of a party. Were you...
Well, that was on your list of things here, and I see you're just going down the list you sent me, which is fine. As far as I know, that is not true. And I'm not saying you've been misled. I think what people are at a distance tending to forget things, and that could happen. It could even happen to me. I was not at any such meeting in New York. My understanding is that there were several meetings of libertarian and anarchist and objectivist, a whole spectrum of people who could generally be called libertarians, at least in the broad sense, met a couple of times in New York in that period, 1969, 1970. As far as I know, none of those meetings was specifically for the purpose of thinking about or discussing the formation of a new party. It's entirely possible that someone or more than one someone spoke at one or both of those events and threw that idea out for consideration. I can't rule that out because I wasn't there. But there was no specific, as far as I know, there was no specific meeting ever called in New York in 1969 or 1970 to discuss the formation of a new party.
Okay, now he mentioned people that I know. I'm going to need to get David Akin on this YouTube thing. And thank you, Julian, for watching on YouTube because it helps my view hours, to talk about the ballot access struggles in Colorado, since Colorado is so pivotal to Libertarian Party history. And I'll have to ask him about Gail Norton. But isn't that a shame that a Libertarian got poached by the Republicans and then turned around and tried to screw us out of ballot access? And the person responsible for having the easy ballot access in Colorado that we now enjoy is David Akin. So it would be really nice to speak with him a bit to get his recollections. And Paul Grant, who I met recently and gave me some historical documents, he was a chair, national chair for a bit. I believe that was in the 80s. Okay, next one. Dave talks about what he views at this time, again, 4 days before 9/11, the successes of the Libertarian Party.
Well, let's move out of the history and sort of into expectations. What have been the LP's biggest successes, in your opinion?
That's a good question. They obviously have not been in the political arena at the presidential level. I don't know if you were able to locate that article from magazine.
Yeah, I read it.
Yeah. I think there are people are sort of mesmerized by the glamour of the presidential race, and they think, ooh, we can get our ideas into the national political arena, by having a presidential candidate who will speak forthrightly and eloquently, and will get all this great media coverage. Well, by and large, it has not been particularly successful because to participate meaningfully at the presidential level, you've got to have a lot more name recognition or a lot more money or a lot larger support base. You need at least two of those things, of those three things. And we've never really been competitive at that level. So that's not the proper gauge to use in measuring our success. I think our successes have been in several areas. First of all, in building by far the nation's and probably the world's largest network of freedom-minded individuals who've been able to collaborate with each other and inform each other on a whole range of issues and work on, particular issues, form, coalitions and committees and action groups on all kinds of issues, ranging from Second Amendment rights to fighting censorship to trying to repeal the drug war, which we haven't done yet. But and that is, we've created this network of freedom-minded, I'm stumbling over my words today, freedom-minded individuals who have been, able to work with varying degrees of success on a lot of issues. And I think that's very important. If it weren't for the Libertarian Party, I don't see any way that network would have come into existence. We have certainly popularized the word libertarian and what it means and brought it to the American people. We have helped bring about the change that I predicted would come when I wrote my article on political systems 30 years ago, that the debate has largely shifted from the old left-right debate. It's still there, but it's fading to a much more fundamental debate, which I would call the libertarian versus authoritarian debate, which is what most of the public dialogue in this country is about now. It's not always labeled as such, but that's what it has become, because the liberal and conservative positions have become more and more indistinguishable. A year 2001 Republican, with rare exceptions like Ron Paul, is indistinguishable from a 1970s or 60s or 70s Democrat. The Republicans are basically just out there passing more laws, grabbing more money, spending it on their projects and giving it to their friends. There really is no significant difference, in my estimation, between the Republicans and Democrats, and we are the only credible alternative. We are seeing a realignment of the political axis or political spectrum, which would be typified by us on one end, the Greens on the other, and the Republicans and Democrats sort of mushing together more and more into a big lump in the middle. And we are helping to redefine the political spectrum and hold up the standard at one end. Because if we weren't there, there'd be nobody else holding up the pro-freedom position.
Right.
So those two things, building the network and helping redefine the political system and make sure that the pro-freedom, pro-individual rights position is accurately and articulately represented, I think are our two major contributions. Now, you get down to the nuts and bolts level, libertarians have been very instrumental, not always working as the Libertarian Party. Again, this is that importance of that network building, in doing things like opposing local tax increases, bond issues. I know in Denver you fought things like the light rail thing and the stadium thing, and I don't know what all, with varying degrees of success. Richard Ryder down in San Diego has been very successful. He's regarded, all the media always come to him immediately. He's the man as far as leading the battle against the assault on the taxpayer's pocketbook. And Ryder and the people that he has organized, all of them libertarians, have over the last decade saved something like $12 billion.
Wow.
In the city of San Diego alone. I'm making that number up. If you want Ryder's email, I can give it to you, and I'm sure he'd be glad to give you some specifics on the things they've been able to accomplish. I'm most familiar with what they're doing down there because where I live, Orange County, California, is midway between L.A. and San Diego. So I'm about equally familiar with what goes on in both of those cities, and San Diego is certainly the largest and best organized city or county Libertarian Party in America. If the San Diego Libertarian Party split off from California and became a separate state party, the San Diego Libertarian Party were a state party, it would be one of the 10 largest.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They've got over 1,000 registered dues-paying libertarians and dues-paid members of the party in the city and county of San Diego, which is pretty impressive considering that although San Diego is a big city, it's not New York or L.A.
Right.
About the third the size. It's got about 3 million people versus 8 or 9 million in New York and L.A. So, for a city that's a third the size of the two biggest cities, it's got a very large, very well-organized Libertarian Party. We've been much more successful at the city and county level, obviously, in terms of leading or opposing initiatives, running candidates and getting them onto city councils, into public offices. We've had a fair amount of success, at least in terms of vote totals and in affecting the debate at the congressional level. And you get above that, and with rare exceptions, our success starts to turn into failure or becomes less successful. Our efforts are less and less successful as you move up the ladder of partisan politics. Let's put it that way.
Ooh, I feel like I got to sneeze. Oh, pardon me, man. It's like, how it's on the tip of your nose type thing. Now, I found that very interesting. A lot of the things he counted as successes, I don't think we really think about today. But popularizing the word libertarian, that is quite a success because it brings the ideas into the discussion. And I think I forgot what clip number I'm on. I don't want to forget that was clip number 4. So the next one will be clip number 5. And hello, Lindsay. And yes, it is very appropriate. I figured this retrospective would be good. And we can see the differences between the 30-year anniversary and now with us in the 50-year anniversary. So the successes probably have remained the same. Now, I don't know if the San Diego party is still that big. I'd be very interested in hearing that. A lot of people, LP members, are very surprised to learn how successful or vibrant the California party is. We tend to think of California as just being this ultra-progressive stronghold, which of course it is. But the Libertarian Party is very strong there because the Republican Party is virtually non-existent. I mean, they're there, but libertarians are pretty strong there. I'd love to hear if anyone from California is listening to this at any point, either live or in the future, to let me know about the San Diego party. Okay, next clip we have from David is speaking of what he saw as the future of the party at that time. Again, this interview was 4 days before 9/11.
Well, let's be optimistic for a minute and say the LP is going to be successful.
Okay.
Is it more likely that it becomes a major political party in its own right, or that the Republicans start losing so much that they adopt many of our ideas? Like a lot of libertarians draw a parallel to what happened in the Socialist Party.
That's a real interesting question. And if you excuse me when I could keep cutting you off because I've got a cough today. I don't know why, some kind of post-nasal drip, and I don't want to blow your eardrum out, particularly if you're on speakerphone. So if the phone goes silent for a moment, it's because I'm coughing and have covered the mouthpiece.
Okay.
That could go either way, and that's always been a question we've faced from the earliest days, to hark back to the point you raised about what was our hope or expectation. Way back 30 years ago, where did we see the party going? Some people maintained from the beginning that as soon as we began to be a significant presence on the political scene and started achieving an impact on elections, that the Republicans would scurry back to the pro-freedom side of the fence and become a lot more consistent. I would like to believe that, but the evidence has been to the contrary, that over the last 30 years, the Republicans have gotten steadily worse. What has Bush done, aside from appoint Gail Norton and Lynn Scarlett, that would give you any cause for optimism that Bush and the Republicans...
And this, I think it cuts out for 1 sec, and then it comes back in. Maybe not. I thought for sure it did. Oh, here we go.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, good. Bush and the Republican Party, as far as I can see, offer no reasonable hope. In fact, they've been getting worse. And the likelihood that they will steal our ideas is one that, you have mixed feelings about. Like, well, hey, those are our ideas. Why should you steal them and get all the credit for them? And on another level, a sort of surreptitious hope that, gee, it would be nice if they would actually adopt some of our ideas and put them into practice. And even if, we didn't get credit for them, they'd be changes for the good, and we'd like to see them in our lifetime. I haven't seen much evidence that they're likely to do that. The excuse that the Bush administration has been giving is, well, you got to get things through Congress, and that's always difficult, and it's compromise, and blah, 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 especially since Jeffords switched and you now have a democratically controlled Senate. But that's simply not true. Witness the fact that they had an opportunity to do something very significant that required no approval or participation from Congress, and that was to kill those medical reporting requirements that Clinton put through in the waning days of his presidency by declaration. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Where the Clinton administration decreed that as of some certain date, and I think it's January 1, 2002. I don't know, but some date in the fairly near future. Basically, all your medical records become essentially the property of the government. And the government can demand, they won't store them all in a central repository, at least not at first, but the government basically will, the federal government and presumably eventually the state government, will have access to everybody's medical records all the time. And of course that means the insurance companies will too. They are effectively putting in a significant chunk of the apparatus that's necessary to nationalize health care, and there's another form of population control, literally the power of life and death over people eventually. And they just decreed that. That was never passed as a law. They just passed that, they just decreed that as an administrative decree. It was scheduled to go into effect. All Bush had to do was to tell Thompson, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, kill that, don't do it. There were tens of thousands of people sent in letters and petitions urging them to kill it, and they let it stand. Now, tell me this is the action or the behavior of a pro-freedom, individual rights president. Here was a case where he didn't have to fight Congress, he didn't have to do anything except simply reverse an administrative decree by the previous president who was a Democrat, and he did not. That, to me, is clearest evidence there is no real functional difference between Republicans and Democrats. As a lot of people have pointed out, there was a greater break in terms of policy between Reagan and Bush the first than there was between Bush and Clinton. There was at least some attempt to scale back government and rein it in under Reagan, not nearly as much as we would like to have seen, but there were a few faltering steps in that direction. So you can really look at the 8 years of Reagan as almost kind of like an anomaly in modern political history, and you can speak of the Reagan years, and then you have to talk about the Bush-Clinton-Bush years, the Bush sandwich with that ham Clinton in the middle. There's no fundamental difference. Bush is not going to do anything remotely libertarian as president because when he's had opportunities to do so, he hasn't. The great majority of Republicans, elected Republicans in the Congress, their hot-button issues are the social conservative issues. They're not that concerned about taxes. In fact, Republicans were busy piling on, adding their favorite pork barrel projects to the last appropriations bill. With the exception of Ron Paul and perhaps one or two others, they're just a different breed of porker than the Democrats. And socially conservative ones whose form of political correctness is different than that of the Democrats, So I can't really see any reasonable prospect that either of the major parties is going to co-opt our ideas. If we had been getting 10 or 15% of the vote in national elections, as some of us had hoped way back when we started, you can bet they would be, because that would be a huge swing vote that they would need to capture. Or even in the congressional elections, if we were regularly getting double-digit figures, we would be a political force to be reckoned with in the immediate sense, and they would be saying, boy, there's that huge vote block up for grabs. The great majority of elections, presidential elections, are settled by less than 10%. They aren't as close as this last one, but you go back and look, there are not very many landslide elections. So 10%, or better yet, 15%, would make you the balance of power. You don't have to be a majority. You don't even have to be close to a majority to have tremendous, political influence, to be a balance of power, to have the balance of power, and therefore be able to call the shots in a lot of areas where you can swing votes one way or the other. We haven't achieved that level of influence, and so the question becomes: can we, if we can't do that, can we become a major party? You'd think that would be, one of the stops on the way to becoming a major party. However, if you follow the theory of what is sometimes called catastrophic change, to sudden and unpredicted change, where pressures build up within a system, whether it's a physical system or an economic system or a political system, you have sudden change as you did in the Soviet Union in 1989. I think it is possible that under the right circumstances, that a charismatic and well-known candidate or candidates could be elected president as a libertarian in 2004 or 2008, or could at the very least throw the political system into realignment and assume that we could assume that balance of power role.
Cool. Here's another issue. You've written favorably about the idea of using the drug war as our lead issue.
I believe that.
Now, but there's a potential problem with that, in that the people who are attracted to the LP because of that issue may not be sympathetic with other issues. Do you think it's likely that we win them over on other issues, or how's that going to play out?
Well, of course, that's a good point. That's always a problem with emphasizing any one particular issue too much. And the drug war certainly has that problem, as does any other issue, whether it's guns or taxes or education, or pick an issue. No matter what issue you pick as your lead issue, you're going to have people who are going to be repelled as well as people who are attracted. The reason I think the drug war is so important and needs to be our primary issue is because it impacts everything else. The war on drugs is the excuse. It's the battering ram of the state. It's the excuse that's being used to say, well, we got to be able to look at people's bank accounts. We can't have financial privacy because, people could be hiding drug money. Well, we got to take away people's guns because, after all, all that drug-caused violence. The drug war, the whole drug issue, the whole drug legalization issue has impacted every other issue, whether it's spending, whether it's financial privacy, whether it's censorship, the mandatory minimum sentences. It's the most insidious issue. It certainly shouldn't be our only issue. I think it needs to be always presented in the context of the government is too large, too powerful, too expensive, too dangerous, and the links made that you can't defend our rights to privacy, our rights to keep and bear arms, et cetera, as long as this insidious force is in effect.
Okay, in the Liberty Magazine article, you talk about the LP as being necessary in addition to, like, Cato and the single-issue groups and the educational groups like
right.
The government. So, do you have some kind of sense, how do you think resources might best be spent or developed? In other words, how important is it, should the LP get most of the resources, or should the think tanks get most of it, or how do you think that should all be divvied out, given the relative benefits of the different approaches?
My first answer will be what you could regard as a cop-out, but it isn't, and the answer is, as the individuals who dispense those resources choose. The market will decide. I can tell you where I would put my money, but I certainly wouldn't presume to say, well, of all the dollars out there and man hours and whatever other resources we've got, X percent should go to the LP, and Y percent should go to Reason and Cato, and Z percent ought to go to Gun Owners of America. I have no right. I don't have the wisdom to decide to answer that question in the broad sense. I can only look at, at the array of choices available at any given moment in time, and it will change from moment to moment as various issues become more important, as various groups wax and wane in their effectiveness. Any numbers I gave you or any percentages I gave you, if I were willing to do so, would be outdated next month or next year.
Presumably there's also a lot of synergy. Some groups will then feed off onto other groups.
Well, that's the next point. It's not as if there's a fixed pie. It's not as if we've got, $20 million out there, that there's a $20 million budget that has been collected and is sitting in a bank account, and there's some central committee of 8 or 10 or 20 people sitting around the table, trying to budget that and saying, well, if we give $1 to Cato, it can't go to the LP, and if we give $1 to the LP, it can't go to the advocates, and so on and so on. There is no bucket of money. There is no central repository. There is no central committee. And that's the way it should be. The amount of money that's available is not a fixed amount, and there's no one person or a group of persons allocating it, and I don't believe there should be. Now, in terms of a general, broad answer, I'll give you a very, very broad answer. Having made all those qualifications, I'll give you a very broad answer and say that at the present time, let's say we've got think tanks, one-issue groups, and the LP. I would be inclined to say roughly a third each. Maybe a little less for the one-issue groups because no one issue is that important.
Okay, that's cool.
I think that the think tanks do... I think the think tanks do a lot of good, but I don't think they do nearly as much good as they would like to have you believe. Just as, libertarian candidates and LP activists like to oversell our importance in the role, the great scheme of things as far as bringing about change, etc. I think anybody who's in a position of having to raise funds does that. And so consequently, I think, you look at what Reason or Cato or Heartland or any of the others actually accomplish, and the picture gets a lot murkier. I mean, you can say Cato's published 7 zillion policy studies. Yeah, they have. And many of them are very good. And I sincerely wish that all the policy recommendations, or since I haven't read all of them, I shouldn't say all, but that the great majority of the policy recommendations that Cato has put forth or that Reason has put forth, I sincerely wish that those would be implemented. In fact, I wish they had been implemented long ago. I'm 100%, or at least 90%, I'm sure, behind the proposals or in agreement with the proposals that the think tanks make. However, when you get to the question you asked about how effective has the LP been, how effective has Reason or Cato actually been? And I only cite them because they're the two biggest. There's regional ones, like Heartland, and there's dozens of those think tanks,
right.
Policy studies groups, and most of them do good work to one degree or another. And I'm glad that we have them. But that said, okay, how many of Cato's policy recommendations have actually been picked up and passed into law and implemented into policy by, say, Congress? Because they concentrate, they're in Washington and they basically put out policy proposals that they push at Congress and the national policymakers. How many of them have actually been implemented? Not very many that I can see. There may be some, but I'm sure if there were a huge string of massive successes, that the folks at Cato would be talking about them a lot more. They'd say, look, we proposed X, and, Congressman Paul brought it to the floor, wrote up a bill to implement it, and it passed, and now, they've demolished or they've dismantled this whole huge arm of government, discontinued this program, since most of their policies are do less policies. I have to question whether, in terms of actually achieving social change, the think tanks are any more effective than the LP, and in some ways, they may even be less effective because they are trying to get the Republicans and Democrats, primarily the Republicans, to implement changes within the system. And as I said before, I think the Republicans on balance have been getting worse. So, I wish them all the luck in the world. I think they do good work. I'm glad we have all that information, all those policies.
Okay, that was it for that clip. I disagree with David there a bit as well. Though, you know, I wouldn't think to go one third. I'm not really interested in that discussion, but I'm interested in his downplaying of the single issue groups. I've become convinced, actually, that the single issue groups, not necessarily even the groups, but single issue focuses, is where we're going to have the most success. Particularly if the LP would partner with some of them. And it's easy, well, easy's probably not the right word, but I think it's easier to pinpoint an issue whose time has come, get behind it, and watch it topple. And we would have those successes under our belts. I've preached that till I'm blue in the face in Colorado, until I'm pink in the hair. And it hasn't really picked up. But, I mean, I could lay out for you, if I were state chair of Colorado, which I'm not, and I don't want to be, what I would do, which is radically different than what the Colorado Party has been doing so far, with the exception of they are concentrating a lot on the single issue, which is in our face right now, which is the COVID thing. Our state chair is quite excellent at that. But I mean beyond an emergency situation. Okay, let's go to the next one, which is getting back into history a little bit more. Let me look at my notes. Okay, he's talking about the party headquarters, which has moved quite a bit. I think we're pretty stable now in Virginia, right outside of D.C., but it's been all over the place. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
Okay, when the party moved to Washington, D.C.
The first time or the second time?
Oh, I didn't know there were two times. But I heard that that caused a little bit of animosity among some people in Colorado. Is that true, or what happened exactly?
You know, I don't really care to speculate on that. I can give you some of the chronology. After the 1974 convention in Dallas, Texas, Ed Crane, now head of the Cato Institute, was elected chair of the party. And one of the points he had run on in his campaign for chair was he did not feel it was appropriate to move the party to Washington, D.C., because that would just make us part of the problem, so to speak. You know, that once you move to Washington, D.C., you're enmeshed in the system, and that trying to maintain our independence and our radical stance and our separation from our ability to critique the political system without being corrupted by it. I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, no, we should not move the office to Washington, D.C. His opponent, a young fellow named Eric Scott Royce, who lived in the Washington, D.C. area, had campaigned on a platform consisting in part of a proposal that the party should be moved to Washington, D.C. And I think that was partly because he felt it was where a national party should be headquartered, and partly because he lived there and he thought that would be a better place to have it. Well, Crane won by a pretty good margin. The party's headquarters was moved from Denver to San Francisco, which is where Crane lived, and they rented an office out there. And after about a year, in about 1975 or 1976, Crane did an about-face and said, yes, the party should be in Washington, D.C. And they picked up and moved the party to Washington, D.C. Well, a lot of people felt they had been deceived or betrayed. Just an aside, that if you talk to a lot of people who were around the libertarian movement in the 70s, you will find that Ed Crane lied to everybody he could, every opportunity, every time he could, if it was to his own advantage to do that. The party was in Washington, D.C. for, 2, 3, 4 years. Then we had another, and after another one of the elections, the headquarters was moved to either Dallas or Houston. I think Houston, because whoever we had elected chair, and I don't have all my notes in front of me. You don't want to go into all this, probably.
Right.
But it was moved to Houston, Texas for 2, 3, 4 years. And then it was moved back, and it's been there ever since. So the loose chronology is Denver, San Francisco, D.C., Houston, back to D.C. But it's been back in D.C. now for, probably 14, 15 years.
Right, okay. Well, that's good enough. Okay, when you moved...
And it probably is the right place for the headquarters to be. at this point. I don't want to get into the pros and cons of whether it should or shouldn't have been moved at various times, but it's where it is now, and it's probably where it should be, and I have no doubt it's where it's going to stay. So it's kind of almost not worth going into, is all I'm saying. You know, if you want to, you know, you might just note that, you know, after starting in Colorado, that the party headquarters was relocated several times, and, you know, has been in Washington D.C. for. I could get you the year if you wanted, but it's got to be almost half of its 30-year existence by now.
And we remain. Well, we're just outside of D.C. I believe at the time of this interview, we were at the Watergate building, ironically enough. And we moved from the Watergate building into the Alexandria address that we have now, where we bought a building. Okay, next one. I just have it titled Rothbard. So apparently he's talking about Rothbard, but I can't remember the context. So let's see.
Okay, so Rothbard became...
Rothbard, in fact, there were some fairly lengthy descriptions, as I recollect, of those gatherings in Rothbard's newsletter that he used to publish way back in the 60s and 70s and on, I guess, into the early 80s. And he eventually got tired of publishing it. I've even forgotten what it was called. I've got back copies buried in the attic somewhere. It was called...
Libertarian Forum.
Libertarian... something or other.
So what was his relationship with the LP after it got formed?
He was not supportive for the first year or two. In fact, he ran an article in his newsletter in about in 1972. That would have been the right time frame. Basically saying this was a silly idea and the time had not come and we'd be wasting our time and blah, 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 blah. But by, say, 1974, he'd done a complete 180, something Rothbard was well known for doing over his life on every conceivable issue. I don't know if you know much about Murray Rothbard. He was a very interesting character, very bright guy, very, very colorful, very garrulous. I liked Murray a lot, but he was more driven by personality things, you know, but by people's personalities. He got into a lot of battles over his life with a lot of people. He was notorious for having had, you know, friendships or alliances with various people, and then a year or 2 or 5 years later, having a falling out with them, and becoming very bitter and denouncing them in, you know, all kinds of terrible terms and so forth. He went from being an opponent of the party in its earliest days to being a strong supporter of the party. In fact, he was on the platform committee every convention for years on end into the mid or late 1980s, and then he had a falling out and he became bitterly anti, if not the party, at least many of its leaders in the latter years of his life. He died 5 or 6 years ago now.
Okay. Now,
very interesting guy. I always got along well with him, but a lot of people didn't.
Yeah, that's my impression.
That is interesting. But it's interesting that he said that Rothbard was an opponent for the first few years, which, you know, I'm not going to doubt his recollections. I know by 74 he was not. He was part of making the Dallas Accord at the Dallas Convention in 74. But in 72, I know he wrote that article in the Libertarian Forum, but then immediately after that, he agreed to become Dr. Hosper's economic advisor for the 1972 campaign. So I think he became a supporter a little bit earlier than David is recollecting. Now, here, and I've got some other material. I'm going to have to switch between screens. But we have David talking about the dispute over where the party was founded.
Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start. There's some controversy as to where and when the LP was actually founded, so I thought you could explain that.
What is the nature of the controversy as you have heard it? I'm just curious what misinformation has emerged lately, because it seems to pop up every few years and we have to bat it down again.
Well, basically, there's a debate over whether it was founded in Westminster or down in Colorado Springs.
Well, technically it was founded in Colorado Springs. The initial planning meetings were the first couple of meetings at which we discussed forming the party and, you know, scratched our heads and decided we needed to find out if there was any support for the idea. Those occurred at my home in Westminster, where I was living at the time.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, the city council in Westminster 5 years ago, I guess it was the city council, passed a resolution. Somebody had tipped them off, and they made that officially commemorate the founding of the Libertarian Party in their city. I guess not a lot happens in Westminster, and they wanted to be on record as having had something important happen there. However, actually, the meeting, what happened was as the summer and fall progressed, we added a couple people from Colorado Springs to our initial core group, so to speak, and we started having some of the meetings down there, and the meeting at which we actually officially voted to form the party was in Colorado Springs. It was at the home of a gentleman named Luke Zell, Z-E-L-L. I believe he is now deceased.
L-U-C-K? I mean L-U-K-E?
Luke, L-U-K-E.
Okay.
As in, Matthew, Mark, Luke,
All right.
etc. And he lived in Colorado Springs, and he was our first life member, gave us $100, which in 1971 was worth more than it is today.
Well, do you know what was the official date of that?
December 11th.
Okay.
I'll go back on the regular phone. Obviously, the speaker-to-speaker thing isn't working real well. December 11th, 1971 is the actual official birth date of the Libertarian Party.
Okay.
Okay, now I wanted to show you something interesting that I had. I'm going to have to set these scenes up, though, as I told you. Okay, so going to have to want to keep that. Don't want that. Don't want that. There we go. And let me move me over to the little black square here. Here is the agenda for that meeting where the city of Westminster was going to, it's a memo for the agenda. Adopt the proclamation that the Libertarian Party was founded in Westminster, thus starting the founding battles. And I have the actual proclamation, which we have a framed copy of in Colorado. Here we go, the Westminster, Colorado Proclamation. I just laughed where he said, must not be very many significant things that happen. And apparently there is also, or at least was also, a sign in Westminster declaring it the birthplace of the Libertarian Party. I don't know if Colorado Springs fired back. Don't have any evidence that they did, but here is Westminster, Colorado owning us. I mean, in the good way, not in the way that we use owning now, I suppose. So I figured that was a good opportunity to share that little clip. Now let's go back to where we were. Let me put back up the chat, if I can find it. Here we go, move me back into the little box because I couldn't get this to stick. Okay, now to the next clip, which I believe he's talking about why the Libertarian Party was founded.
So what are the events that led up to the founding of the LP, and why was it specifically in Colorado? Was that just because that's where a number of you live?
To answer the second question first, yes. What triggered my concern, and at the time, in 1970 and 71, I had been fairly active in the Young Republicans, starting with the Goldwater campaign in 1964, which was when I was in school. And I stayed semi-active in the YRs through the years that followed up till 1971. Now, as you may remember, or you probably don't, since you were born that same year, but as you may have heard, on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and decreed wage and price controls, which was the first time that had ever been done during peacetime in American history. And we were technically in peacetime. The police action or military action in Vietnam was never officially declared as a war. It was totally unconstitutional, of course. So we had a first peacetime imposition of wage price controls, plus taking the U.S. off the last vestiges of the gold standard. You know, we had been off the gold standard since 1933 or 34 in terms of Americans' ability to redeem their dollars for gold, but the dollar was still pegged to gold for international transactions, which naturally added put kind of a bit of a brake on their ability to inflate. So the governments always want to remove any impediments to their inflating the money supply ad infinitum, And Nixon basically said, well, we're tired of being on the gold standard. We don't want that thing standing in our way. So as of now, the U.S. dollar is no longer redeemable in gold anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And we all know how much inflation we saw in the 70s. So those 2 points, which he made in that same speech on August 15th, were the impetus for those of us who'd been thinking about it. We'd had a couple of meetings before that. That was either our second or third meeting, happened to fall on the day of Nixon's speech. And, of course, we didn't know when we set our meeting a week or 2 or 3 in advance that was going to happen. But we were sitting around in my living room in Westminster on August 15th, and who should come on but Richard Nixon? I guess it had been announced that he was coming on to make an important announcement. And that was the announcement that he made, and we looked at each other and said, well, that settles it. If there was ever any doubt as to whether we need a party that stands for some kind of real limited government and individual freedom, then this should settle it for us.
I need to try to find that clip from Nixon. That's pretty important, it seems, in party history. Okay, I've just got one last clip. Again, this wasn't the entire interview, but I think it was the most juicy parts, or the ones I think most people will be interested in. The entire interview is again available on the YouTube channel of the Libertarian Party Historical Preservation Committee, and it is also on LPedia if you look up David Nolan Reflects on the 30th Anniversary. So this last one, David is talking about the expectations that they had for the party when they founded it.
What were your expectations for the LP back in 1971, and then how the party evolved, diverged from what you thought would happen?
Well, I suppose like a lot of very optimistic young people, and I was 28 at the time, we had hopes. Maybe expectations is too strong a word, but we certainly had hopes that we were going to become a major party, maybe not one of the major parties, maybe not replacing the Republican or Democratic Party, but become a major party in the sense of having the balance of power and being able to strongly influence the political debate and act as a swing vote within, like by 1980. And, of course, that didn't quite happen.
All right, now what's interesting there is I'm comparing it to the formation of the People's Party, which I've been following very closely. And that's also a bunch of mostly young people, because David was really young to be a party founder, 28 years old. And at first he had said their expectation or hope was to become a major party, but then he softened it a bit and said, or to at least become the swing vote, which is a lot more reasonable. The People's Party are just calling themselves already a major new party, which is not correct. And I think maybe they're practicing the secret where they're just going to speak their reality into being. We'll see how that works out for them. But I also like that idea where he talked about you don't have to replace one of the two major parties to be a power player. You just need to be the swing vote. And even with our smaller percentages, we see that happen, right? How many times are we accused of spoiling the election? So our, less than 5%, generally, each election, it does have a big effect in certain selected areas. And that makes us important in the larger scheme of things. So aiming for that larger swing vote is a very doable and admirable goal, rather than focusing on becoming the next major party or winning the whole thing. To keep our eye on things that are actually actionable and doable. So that is all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed it. It was very interesting to hear how David Nolan was very much a political geek. He was interested in politics for politics' sake. I have a difficult time relating to that because I'm not. I hate politics. I still hate politics. It's gross, and if anyone calls me a politician, I just want to retch. So when I'm told I'm not a very good politician, that makes me smile. I'm not a political geek. I am more in it for the pure philosophy. So it's interesting to see that difference, and I like hearing how his mind thinks. I suppose you would have to be a political geek to found a party rather than a think tank or some sort of philosophical society. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, Julian and Lindsay, for watching on YouTube rather than Facebook, because it does help my view hours. So I hope you all have an awesome night, and within the next few days, I'll have some more things for you. Bye-bye.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe.